Good afternoon and welcome to all of you who have joined us for this SPE live session, a Gaia talk with oil and gas experts on climate matters. It's great to see so much interest in this topic, and I invite you all to drop your questions or comments in the chat box and we will try to pick them up. Today's session is perfectly timed as we only have 3.5 weeks left until the event on climate. Not only for our industry, but the whole world. COP26 is happening in the first 2 weeks of November in Glasgow. My name is Ulrike Schopp. I'm the Chief of Staff for IPIECA, and I'm also managing the IPIECA COP26 Task Force, and it's my pleasure to moderate this session today. We are super grateful to have two industry experts on the line who are not only bringing a lot of expertise on climate matters, but also have decades of experience with the Conference of the Parties, the so-called COPs. Arthur Lee is Chevron Fellow and Senior Strategy Advisor in the Energy Transitions team within Chevron's Corporate Strategy and Sustainability Group. David Hone works for Shell International and is the Chief Climate Change Advisor in the Shell Scenarios team. You will find more background on both of them online in the description of this event, but I would like to keep it very short to ensure we have enough time to speak and especially to listen to both of them. For both of you, welcome to the session and thank you so much for your time today. Before we start,
thank you.
Could you just quickly mention how many COPs you have attended or which was your first one?
Go on, Arthur.
Okay, I started at COP5. I was in Bonn.
And I started at COP6 Biz in The Hague in 2001. And I think the first person I met on the first day I was there was Arthur.
That's right. That's when we first met. It's a long time ago, yes.
Great, yeah, that's really impressive. So, looking forward to the conversation today. David, starting with you. Just recently, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has released its Working Group 1 report. There's a summary for policymakers available which contains many urgent messages from the physical science perspective. For example, that many of the changes due to past and future greenhouse gas emissions are already irreversible for centuries to millennia. How do you think, or rather expect, policy and decision makers to pick this up during the upcoming COP negotiations?
Right, well, thanks for the question. So I think the key piece of information out of this report is the way in which they focused on the carbon budget. And the carbon budget is the cumulative amount of emissions left to emit before you reach a certain temperature, be it 1.5, 1.7, 2 degrees. And for 1.5 degrees C, this carbon budget is vanishingly small. It's about 400 gigatons, but compare that with a rough 40 gigatons of emissions per annum at the moment from all of the global activities, including the energy system, including industry, and including land use change. So if you don't start to see a rapid reduction in emissions, we will pass that budget and therefore pass 1.5 degrees C. And this is the key number that's really informing the push in Glasgow towards rapid reductions in the 2020s and net zero emissions by 2050. And policymakers really have to pay attention to this, that you can really boil this down to one number at the moment.
Thanks, David.
If I may add a little bit to that, Ulrike.
I was just about to ask you, Arthur.
Okay, no, thank you. Thank you, Ulrike. Thank you, David. I think I'll address the question slightly differently from a perspective of history. As some of the people in the audience may not know this, but the IPCC itself is a UN process, is a UN body, and it's actually been in existence since 1988 when it was first formed by the World Meteorological Organization and the UN Environment Program as a joint process. So it's been around a long time, and it has gone through several assessments. As we know, this is the 6th assessment cycle now. So it is. Over time, it has become really the basis for international negotiation by the UNFCCC. And I think what is more important to the point here of the negotiation itself with the IPCC is that it's the UNFCCC, the COP negotiators, the COP negotiation, that at the end of the day, they often have to recognize the report. So now this sounds like a technical point, but it was very interesting that the development in COP24 Katowice, that the COP actually had trouble recognizing the special report on 1.5 degrees global warming. So I just want to flag that even though it seems like a minor point, it's still something, it's still a negotiation point, even at the COP level, when the IPCC report comes out, whether it can be recognized or not. So just want to put it out there. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Arthur. Much appreciated. I know you're monitoring these processes very closely, so that's great. When talking about the COPs, experts always mentioned Article 6. The negotiation about how to implement it have kept the parties busy for already some COPs. Could you, Arthur, please quickly describe what Article 6 entails and why it is so challenging to find an agreement on it?
Yeah, I'll be very brief. Here's a point that that Article 6 is really about international cooperation. In fact, in the ramp up to the Paris Agreement, it has an informal title, and it was called Cooperative Approaches. So in some ways, it is ironic that that Article 6 has not yet reached agreement and has in fact failed in negotiations at COP24 Katowice and also COP25 in Madrid. The key issues that keep dividing countries apart has to do a lot with some of the older issues from the clean development mechanism of the Kyoto Protocol. So one example, very brief example, is that CDM activities that are still ongoing, project activities, whether they would be recognized under the Paris regime, under Article 6 that is still one of the key issues. So, and also the credits that have been generated. So I think I ought to turn it over to David. David also has, I think, several points.
Thanks, Arthur. Let me just say a couple of additional things. Although Article 6 actually only talks about cooperative arrangements, in fact, the way it's being negotiated is around the basis of emissions trading carbon units across national borders, and as we know from emission trading systems that already exist around the world, emissions trading requires a diligence and rigor of accounting that doesn't exist at a global level yet. And so I think one of the obstacles in Article 6 is it takes countries down a pathway towards much more rigorous accounting, much greater transparency and accountability, and the need to adjust their own carbon inventories based on what they trade. And so even though Article 6 is voluntary in nature, it brings with it quite a, I wouldn't say burden, but quite a requirement for countries to use. And of course, there's a reluctance around this because it's really where the rubber hits the road. Now, why do you even need Article 6? And I think the reason is that you can't actually get to net zero emissions without it. Because as we head through the years and we approach much lower levels of emissions, there's going to be areas of society where emissions are not going to be abated, be it in the agricultural sector or the aviation sector. There's just not going to be an abatement in the near term. So you're going to continue to have emissions. And of course, the key to that is the word net. Net zero means that you match emissions that you have with sinks or removals. Now, these are not going to be in the same place. In fact, they're bound to be across borders. And so you need to be able to trade with counterparties for everybody to reach net zero emissions. And that's why it's such an important piece of the puzzle. But it also points to why it's so difficult to negotiate, because it really takes you into deep accounting around emissions.
Thanks, David. Thanks, Arthur. Talking about emissions, I just see there's a question upcoming in the chat from John Dean. He says, my problem with the emission problem is how do you make any significant changes without a huge increase in emissions in order to make the desired required change? You have any initial response to that?
Yeah, so this is quite an interesting question. And it's one actually that popped up in our company a few weeks ago by chance. And so I actually did some numbers on it. And yes, you need a lot of industrial activity to transform the energy system. But at least by the calculations I did, it's not that material. It's important. You can't dismiss it, but it's not the big thing that you might think about. You actually get far more in emission reductions, even in the shorter term, than you do through the emissions required to transform the energy system. So, we haven't got time to share all the numbers and go through the spreadsheets, but I did actually look at this, and it surprised me that it was smaller than I thought, but not immaterial. It is still important.
Yeah, I think this is where maybe it's good to point out that we do have solutions, and one of those is carbon capture and storage. I think we need to have that in order to actually start driving emissions down from fossil fuels. As is pointed out, not just by our sector, really has been pointed out for several years, if not longer, by the IPCC itself. IPCC in the 5th assessment report already pointed that out, about the critical nature of having CCS, not only in order to reach a well below 2 degree goal, but also in order to have lower costs to society of emissions. If you exclude CCS, the cost of abatement would simply rise. And so now in the 6th assessment report, which is coming out in working with 1, 2, and 3 in the next, already 1's out, but 2 and 3 will be out early next year, is that there will have to be more reckoning of how much CCS we will need, and it is again deemed to be critical. Certainly in the 1.5 degree report that came out in October 2018, it was again pointed out that both bioenergy CCS coupled with CCS is one of the key solutions, as well as direct air capture, which require CCS on the back end. So all of that, I think, will be very important to the world. So thank you.
Thank you both. And actually, it's a perfect link to one of the next questions from the audience. Andrew is asking, is CCS ready to roll out at scale yet?
The short answer is yes, but let me pass to Arthur, because Chevron operates the largest CCS project in the world.
Yes, thank you, David. Yes, it is operating and it is injecting. But more to the point here as well is it is scaling up, but it will require collaboration, partnership from governments, from stakeholders around the world to make these projects at scale and deploy more and more of them as possible. So even this morning, I was in another meeting with the IEA greenhouse gas program, and it was very apparent to me and to many people in the community, in industry and in the CCS world of experts, that there's just not enough activity right now in looking at the geological resources of various countries that have a high level of emissions, and we need to do more of that in order to really scale up CCS. Even here in the United States, where I live, back in 2019, the National Petroleum Council published a study in which Shell, BP, Chevron, many others have contributed to that report. ExxonMobil as well contributed to that report, and it was a roadmap. It was deemed a roadmap to deploy, even in the United States, how much policy enabling mechanisms, as well as different kind of infrastructure that will be needed to scale up CCS to be a material solution, alongside other solutions in the portfolio with renewable energy and others. So yes, it's very important to be able to do that with policy mechanisms.
And I think, it comes back to the very people who are listening to this broadcast from the Society of Petroleum Engineers. CCS is a repurposing of existing technologies in the oil and gas industry. It's about gas handling and compression. It's about drilling and injecting and managing wells and managing subsurface areas. These are all skills that have been fine-tuned over the last 100 years, and they can be applied to CCS and deliver very large-scale projects like the one in Australia that Chevron manages. We have a project in Canada. It was built, it was designed and built and up and running, and we're storing 1 million tons of CO2 per annum. Now, the reality is that all the scenarios point to the need for hundreds of these projects, not ones and twos, even thousands of them in the decades ahead. And so, as Arthur points out, you need a policy environment that's going to encourage these to be built and ensure that this happens. But there is no technical or engineering obstacle to it.
Thank you both. Yeah, and talking about policy environment, there's another question from Joanna Dunlop. David, could you tell us about the global stocktake and perhaps the significance of the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions we keep hearing about, and what role oil and gas play specifically?
Right. Well, this feeds right back into COP26 and the role of the UNFCCC. So there's a little bit of jargon there, which I just will unpack for a sec. NDCs are nationally determined contributions. And this is the way action is packaged at a national level through the Paris Agreement. Governments are presented with information about the global emissions, and they're presented with the goals of the Paris Agreement, and they're asked to go away and decide at a national level what it is that they can contribute to mitigating this problem, and hence the nationally determined contribution. And the requirement under the Paris Agreement is to submit these and then realize them, to go home and actually implement policies to do them. And the global stocktake that is now about to take place and will be fully reported out at COP28, which is in 2023, is the next round of the process whereby there's a full transparency and review of everything that's going on, all the reductions that are taking place, all the NDCs that have been submitted, and how effective they are, and what all this adds up to, and therefore informing governments as to what the next round of the resubmission of NDCs needs to be. And this circular process is the architecture of the Paris Agreement, and it takes place on a 5-year basis. So every 5 years we see a global stocktake and a resubmission of NDCs and an assessment of what's going on. The oil and gas industry has no particular role in this. This is an intergovernmental process, and it's determined by policymakers at a national level. Now, here in the UK where I live, the policymakers will reach out to stakeholders in society to discuss their ideas with them, to ask for submissions, to ask for comments. They'll reach out to energy industry expertise, people like Arthur and myself. But ultimately, governments decide on what their NDCs will be, and they submit them through the Paris process, and then the global stocktake takes place, and as I said, the cycle goes round and round.
Arthur, anything to add from you?
Yeah, just very briefly.
Joanna, just send it to David.
No, that's just very briefly. As pointed out by David very eloquently, this is a governmental process, and these NDCs themselves are nationally determined. They are voluntary contribution. Countries can do what they want. They can commit to what they want to do. They don't have to do any more than what they want to do. And so it is up to stakeholders in each country to, if they want to have the government do more, then they have to advocate for it. So it is very much a voluntary architecture within a mandatory framework for reporting, for transparency, for global stocktake. But at the heart of the Paris Agreement I always say this to everyone, that it is very much a voluntary architecture right in its heart. So it has to be up to the willingness, the political will of countries to enact policies that will get us there, get us to the well below 2-degree goal. So.
Thank you both. Yeah, talking about the NDCs and what countries do you have to do to prepare to mitigate to climate change and also adapt to climate change. This all has to be financed somehow. And at COP21, nations have decided that they would mobilize $100 billion per year by 2021 to help the developing nations with their actions. Where do we stand here and what has to be done during COP26 in Glasgow next month?
Well, let me start. This is one of the key issues on the UK agenda. And you might have seen in just in the last couple of weeks, the UK has been, the UK representatives have been darting around the world, encouraging governments, amongst other things, to contribute more to developing economies that really need help to transition their energy system, or even in some cases to build an energy system from scratch, because they have very little energy infrastructure that's based on renewables and hydrogen and other things rather than on fossil fuels. I think that there's many ways of interpreting the 100 billion, and I think that's been one of the sticking points. For instance, if a company like Shell or Chevron invest at a large scale with renewable energy in a developing country, is that part of the 100 billion? Some people argue that it is. Other people argue that it's just an intergovernmental exchange of finance. And I think we have to move on from that and really look at the total flow of finance and the total financial resource available to developing countries, and help them access that in a productive way. And many of the banks have become involved in this process, and people say, what are the banks doing there? Well, they help facilitate these investments into countries, some of which do actually have higher country risks, but actually they're countries that the oil and gas industry is very used to investing in, because we've developed resources all over the world. So we're well positioned, I think, as an industry, as we ourselves make transitions and invest further in different energy solutions to help this flow take place. But there's no single answer to it. It's not just a question of, President Biden and President Macron and everyone else writing a bigger check. It's far more complicated than that. And it worries me sometimes that it gets trivialized down to a check in the post when that's not what this is about.
Yeah. And if I could, Ulrike, I know we're running out of time, but linking back to the negotiation, to Article 6 itself, as we mentioned earlier, it's about cooperative approaches. So there's both the market components, which can, of course, facilitate this kind of investments in various countries by other countries. So that itself, it also is one key way to mobilize resources and investments. And in fact, in the NDCs of many countries, especially in the developing world, they have pointed out that they have unconditional as well as conditional NDCs. That is, if they receive finance and some sort of technological assistance, they could do more of the conditional contribution, take more actions on a conditional basis. So relating that back to the negotiations.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. I see there's still some excitement in the chat box around CCS. So I've got a good question for you. What would be the demand for petroleum engineers who are experts in CCS? So probably you can now refer to your recruiting experts in your own companies, but do you have any initial response to that?
Well, I would hope that it's very high. And, there's a number of CCS projects now starting to take shape around the world. The US has one of the best investment mechanisms going on CCS. This is a tax credit that that is available through the US federal government. The EU is starting to invest in CCS through its innovation funds, and a number of other countries are looking at it. Australia, for instance, just last week announced that CCS removal units would be viable would be allowed in their emissions trading system. So that opens up the door again. I think I can only go back to what we said earlier, is that any analysis of this problem points to the need for large-scale CCS. So petroleum engineers who are expert in this area ought to see the benefits of that, because if they don't, then you have to question whether the world is really on track to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement.
Right.
So there's a bit of a chicken and egg question there.
And again, back to policy enablers. I think that again would point to whether that in a particular country, whether the profession of petroleum engineering could be enhanced, even with the policies landscape. So one quick point too, I want to point out to all of you members of the society, that not only CCS, but there's also geothermal energy. So geothermal is also could become a key part of the whole portfolio for avoiding greenhouse gas emissions. So that's an important part of it too.
Okay, great. Thank you both. I think as we are approaching the end of the session, I have one final question to the both of you. So you have been mentioning several times that you have observed the COP conferences. So when you are traveling back home from Glasgow by plane or by train in the middle of November, what will you consider to be a success of the negotiations?
Well, there's a lot of emphasis on ambition and net zero emissions and all these things. But for me, it's getting Article 6 over the line and concluding that piece of negotiation and establishing the Article 6 rulebook. It's been going on too long, and it needs to be finished so that business can get on with using it.
Yeah, I cannot agree more with David on that point. Article 6 is also a metric of success for me when I'm on the plane getting back to the U.S. Definitely, I'm very optimistic that Article 6 will be completed this year. But if for any reason it fails again, then I think the world is in some trouble. That we would have to try again in COP27. But it is the one of the key ways for countries to cooperate with each other by either market mechanisms or even non-market mechanisms. It has to be, and that's also in Article 6 in one of the paragraph 8. So non-markets too can play an important role. But most importantly, as some researchers have found fairly recently in the last year and a half, that there is a tremendous value to Article 6. And Article 6, if we leave it on the table, then it will just be that much harder to get to the temperature goals that we want, well below 2 degrees. So, thank you.
Right, thank you very much. So we're coming to the end, and it's now up to me to say thank you both for a very interesting and lively session. Also on behalf of the SPE, I mean, it has been a real pleasure to talk to you both. And I thank the audience for all their questions. I hope you all enjoyed it as much as I did. And we all wish you a great rest of the day, and stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.